Paris, 1719. A Scottish man, a convicted murderer, a professional gambler, a man who had fled England one step ahead of the hangman, is sitting at the center of the most powerful economy in Europe. He controls the national bank. He controls the currency. He controls the colonial trade monopoly stretching from the Caribbean to the Mississippi River. He controls, in a very real sense, France itself. His name is John Law. And the French government didn't just tolerate him, they invited him in. They handed him the keys. They begged him to take over. Here's the part that should stop you cold. At the peak of his power, the word millionaire was coined in Paris, specifically to describe the people getting rich off his scheme. The word didn't exist before him. France didn't need it before him. It also didn't need the economic crater that came after. Within 18 months of that peak, the French financial system collapsed so completely that it would take the country nearly a century to rebuild trust in paper money. The trauma ran so deep that when the French Revolution came, 70 years later, one of the things the revolutionaries were still angry about was John Law. So how does a Scottish gambler end up with a nation in his hands? And once he had it, why did he burn it down? Part 1. A Kingdom Drowning in Debt. Louis XIV died in 1715 after ruling France for 72 years. He built Versailles. He fought half of Europe. He made France the envy of the world. He also left behind a debt so massive it was, by some estimates, larger than the entire annual output of the French economy. Think about what that means. Not, France owed a lot of money. France owed more than France made in a year. Every tax collected, every trade revenue, every coin squeezed from every peasant, all of it combined still wasn't enough to cover what Louis had borrowed. The new king was 5 years old. The regent, Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, was a practical man with an impractical problem. Raise taxes to pay the debt. The population was already at breaking point after decades of war. Default on the debt? That would collapse the banking houses of Europe and make France an international pariah. Print more coins? They'd already debased the currency so many times that people were refusing to accept them. France was caught in a trap that every overborrowed government eventually faces. The debt was too big to pay, too dangerous to cancel, and too embedded to ignore. Enter John Law. Law had a theory. He'd been shopping it around European courts for years. The Dutch said no, the Savoyards said no, the Scots said no, but he never stopped believing in it. His idea was deceptively elegant. Replace metal coins with paper money backed by land and trade. Expand the money supply. Stimulate the economy. Grow your way out of debt. On paper, it was almost visionary. The problem, as France was about to discover, is that paper is not land. And John Law was not a visionary. He was a very persuasive man with very dangerous ideas and a government desperate enough to listen. Philippe gave him the bank, then the trading company, then the currency itself. And for 2 extraordinary years, it seemed to be working, until the moment it became very, very clear that it wasn't. What happened next is one of the strangest episodes in the history of money. Part 2. When a country bought into a fantasy. Law started small, or what passes for small, when you're restructuring a nation's finances. In 1716 he opened the Banque Générale, a private bank with royal backing. It issued paper notes that could be used to pay taxes. This was the hook. If the government accepts your paper has value. Within a year, the notes were circulating freely. The economy, starved of liquid cash for decades, started moving again. Philippe was impressed. Law was given more room to operate. Then came the Mississippi Company. France had a vast colonial territory in North America, a territory called Louisiana, stretching from the Gulf of Mexico up through the center of the continent. In theory, it was rich in resources. In practice, it was mostly swamp, mosquitoes, and a few struggling settlements. But in the imagination of investors who had never been there and never intended to go, it was the next Peru. It was gold waiting to be scooped up. Law took control of the trading rights. He issued shares in the company. And then he did something that no one had quite done before. He created a feedback loop between the company's stock and the national debt. Here's the mechanism, and it's important because this exact trick has been run again and again throughout history right up to the present day. Law allowed investors to purchase Mississippi Company shares using French government bonds, the very bonds that represented the kingdom's crushing debt. The bonds were trading at a fraction of their face value because nobody believed France would ever repay them. But Law accepted them at full face value as payment for shares. Suddenly, those worthless bonds were valuable again. Suddenly, holding French government debt was a winning position. The shares climbed. Word spread. By 1719, the Rue Quincampoix in Paris, the street where shares were traded, was the most crowded street in Europe. Cobblers became merchants. Servants became shareholders. A hunchback reportedly rented out his back as a writing desk for traders too excited to find a table. The paradox, the thing that should have been a warning, was this. The more people believed in the company, the more the shares rose. And the more the shares rose, the more people believed in the company. The actual Mississippi Territory, the actual revenue, the actual gold, none of it mattered. Belief was the asset. John Law understood this better than almost anyone. What he didn't fully account for was what happens when the belief breaks. The French government, now calling itself the owner of the most valuable trading enterprise in the world, was printing money to keep the stock price rising. Here is the part that almost no one in Paris wanted to say out loud. The money and the shares were both worth exactly as much as people agreed they were worth, and not one coin more. That agreement was about to end. Part 3. The moment everyone realized at once. By early 1720, John Law had merged his bank with the Mississippi Company. He controlled both the money supply and the dominant stock in the country. He was made Controller General of Finances, effectively the economic head of state. France had handed a single private individual something no government had ever handed anyone before: complete, unified control over money creation, taxation policy, and colonial trade. For a brief, dizzying moment it seemed to work. Debt was being absorbed. The economy was moving. The shares kept climbing. But cracks were forming. Some of the wealthier investors, the ones who had watched enough bubbles to recognize the shape of one, began quietly converting their shares and paper notes back into gold and silver coin. Law noticed. He panicked. He did what governments have done in every monetary crisis since. He made it illegal. A decree went out forbidding any single person from holding more than 500 livres in coin. Gold and silver were, effectively, banned as stores of value. Only Law's paper notes were legitimate. Think about what this means. The government that had once asked you to trust paper because it was as good as gold was now telling you that gold itself was suspect. The logic had inverted completely, and the French public, who had survived decades of debased coinage, royal bankruptcies, and broken promises, knew exactly what that kind of edict meant. The selling accelerated. In the summer of 1720, a crowd so large gathered outside the Banque Royale to redeem notes for coin that 15 people were crushed to death in the panic. Law reportedly looked out of his carriage window at the mob, at people waving paper notes he had created, demanding metal he no longer had, and understood, perhaps for the first time, the full weight of what he had built. He had not created wealth. He had created the expectation of wealth. And expectation, it turns out, is the most fragile substance in economics. The same mechanism runs today in every leveraged market, every overextended sovereign bond, every cryptocurrency that climbs on narrative alone. The instrument changes. The psychology doesn't. Law fled France in December of 1720, nearly broke, officially disgraced, stripped of his titles. The country he left behind was in shock. But what came after wasn't just financial chaos. It was something deeper, a trauma that would reshape France's relationship with money, debt, and trust in government for generations. Part 4. What a country looks like after it stops believing. John Law died in Venice 9 years later, in 1729. He was gambling again by the end, reportedly down to a single diamond ring that he wagered and lost on his last night. The man who had invented the word millionaire died with almost nothing. France, meanwhile, was left to sort through the wreckage. The Mississippi Company shares collapsed to nearly zero. The paper currency became worthless, in the cruelest possible way, not all at once but gradually, so that families who had been careful and slow to sell were punished more than the ones who had panicked early. The middle class, the merchants, the minor nobles who had converted their old bonds into shares and their shares into notes, they were destroyed. The aristocracy, with their land and their political connections, survived. The very poor had never had paper money to begin with. The system had managed to transfer wealth upward with astonishing efficiency on the way in and on the way out. France's response was telling. The government didn't call it a collapse. They didn't call it a bubble. They called it le système, the system, as if it were a weather event, something that happened to them rather than something they had built and chosen and celebrated. Within a generation, the official history had been quietly rewritten to cast law as a foreign con artist who had tricked a naive kingdom. The more honest version, that France's government had been desperate, complicit, and willfully blind, was uncomfortable to hold. What France never truly recovered was institutional trust. For the next 70 years, the French government could not convince its citizens to accept paper currency in any sustained way. When the revolution came in 1789 and the new government issued paper money called assignats, ordinary French people reacted with visceral fear, a fear that had been passed down through families, through stories, through the living memory of what paper money could become when the man printing it had no gold left to back it. The assignats collapsed too, almost exactly the same way. Rue Quincampoix still exists in Paris. It's quiet now, a narrow street in the old commercial district lined with unremarkable buildings. If you walk it today, you won't find a plaque for John Law, no monument, no memorial. That absence is, in its own way, the most honest thing France ever said about him. Here is what John Law actually understood, and what makes his story so uncomfortable to look at directly. He didn't trick France. Not really. He offered France exactly what France wanted. A way out that didn't require sacrifice, a way to dissolve debt through expansion rather than discipline. A system where everyone could get richer without anyone having to get poorer. France said yes, enthusiastically, repeatedly, right up until the moment it couldn't anymore. Every generation has its John Law. The name changes. The instrument changes. The mechanism, belief detached from underlying value, accelerated by desperation and desire, stays exactly the same. Money, at its core, is a social agreement. And social agreements, when they break fast. If this story left you thinking, it's supposed to. Hit subscribe and follow us on this channel, because the history of money and power is far from finished. Follow the money. Follow the power.